Sometimes the past finds us when we least expect it, and sometimes it changes everything we thought we knew about ourselves. For 70-year-old Einar, a former Viking warrior living alone with his horse in the Norwegian mountains, that moment came during a simple winter ride. A rockslide opened a cave that had been sealed for over 300 years. Inside, Einar found the body of an ancient warrior wearing his family crest. The dead man carried runes telling of betrayal and a blood oath that was never fulfilled. This discovery forced Einar to face the violent past he had tried to forget and the broken relationships with his sons. The cave held more than just old bones and stones. It held secrets that could destroy his family. But what was this warrior's mission, and why does his failure still matter after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Einar Grimson stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. At 70 years old, his hands bore the scars of 1,000 battles. Yet they moved with surprising gentleness as he prepared his morning coffee. The weathered war axe hanging above his stone fireplace caught the early light, its blade still sharp despite decades of peace. It had been 30 years since he'd last raised it in anger. 30 years since he'd traded the longship's deck for the quiet solitude of his mountain farm. The coffee steamed in the ceramic mug his late wife Astrid had made with her own hands, the clay still warm with her memory even 5 years after her passing. She had been the one to convince him that there was more honor in growing things than in destroying them, more courage in healing wounds than in making them. Her touch had transformed him from Einar the Bloody to simply Einar the Farmer. Though the transformation had taken years and left scars deeper than any sword could carve. Outside, his horse Skadi nickered softly from the paddock, her breath visible in the crisp December air. She was 23 years old now, ancient for a horse, with a coat that had turned from black to silver grey, and legs that moved with the careful deliberation of age. She had been his companion for more than 2 decades, through the darkest winters and the longest summers, through grief and guilt and the slow, painful work of learning to live with himself. Einar pulled on his thick wool coat and stepped into boots, worn smooth by years of mountain trails. The farm was small but well tended, with a modest barn that housed Skadi and 3 sheep, a vegetable garden now dormant under snow, and a workshop where he carved wood and mended tools for the few neighbors scattered throughout these remote mountains. It was a simple life, perhaps too simple for a man who had once commanded respect and fear across the North Sea. But it was the life Astrid had wanted for them, and honoring her wishes had become his way of honoring her memory. As he walked toward the paddock, memories flickered through his mind like flames in a dying fire. He remembered the first raid he'd led, barely 18 years old, and burning with the need to prove himself worthy of his father's name. He remembered the weight of gold in his hands, the thrill of victory, the songs sung in his honor in great halls, thick with smoke and mead. But he also remembered the faces of those who had fallen beneath his blade, the villages left in ashes, the children who had watched their fathers die and would grow up to seek vengeance against men like him. Skadi approached the fence with the slow dignity of age, accepting the apple he offered with gentle teeth. Her dark eyes held intelligence and something that looked remarkably like understanding, as if she knew the weight he carried and chose to share it without judgment. She had been a warhorse once, bred for battle and trained to fear neither steel nor fire, but like her master, she had found peace in these mountains and seemed content to let the warrior's life fade into memory. "Good morning, old friend," Einar murmured, stroking her neck. "Shall we take a ride today? The weather looks fine for it." The truth was that these morning rides had become more necessary than recreational. The solitude of the farm, while peaceful, could also become oppressive, filled with echoes of conversations that would never come again, and haunted by the ghosts of choices that could never be unmade. When the silence grew too heavy, when Astrid's absence felt like a physical weight on his chest, he would saddle Skadi, and they would explore the mountain trails together, two old warriors, finding comfort in movement and the vast, indifferent beauty of the Norwegian wilderness. His relationship with his sons had become another source of both comfort and pain. Magnus, his eldest at 45, had followed a different path entirely, becoming a successful architect in Oslo with a wife and 2 children of his own. He visited twice a year, at Christmas and midsummer, bringing news of the modern world and photos of grandchildren who barely knew their grandfather's name. Magnus had inherited his mother's gentle nature and his father's stubborn pride, a combination that had served him well in his chosen profession, but had also created a barrier between them that neither man seemed able to cross. Olaf, the younger son at 42, was a different story entirely. He had inherited more of his father's restless spirit and none of his mother's tempering influence. He worked as a fishing boat captain out of Bergen, a dangerous profession that kept him at sea for months at a time and brought him to shore with pockets full of money and a heart full of demons. His visits were less frequent and more turbulent, usually ending in arguments about responsibility, family obligations, and the weight of the Grimson name. Both sons carried scars from their father's long journey toward peace. They had grown up watching him struggle with nightmares, with sudden rages that would flare and die like lightning, with periods of dark silence when the weight of his past became too much to bear. Astrid had shielded them as much as she could, but children see everything, and they had learned early that their father was a man haunted by more than ordinary sorrows. The irony was not lost on Einar that in seeking to protect his family from his violent past, he had often made himself absent from their present. He had worked the farm with obsessive dedication, throwing himself into physical labor as a way of avoiding the difficult conversations that families require. He had been a provider but not always a presence, a protector but not always a comfort. Now, in the twilight of his life, he found himself wanting to repair those relationships, but uncertain how to bridge the gaps that decades of careful distance had created. As he saddled Skadi with practiced efficiency, Einar reflected on the legacy he would leave behind. The farm would go to his sons, though neither had shown much interest in maintaining it. The workshop tools, the carefully tended garden, the small collection of books and artifacts that told the story of his transformation, all of it felt suddenly fragile, temporary, like a sandcastle built too close to the tide. What worried him most was the family history that would die with him. His father and grandfather had been warriors too, part of a long line of men who had shaped their identity through strength and conquest. But they had also been storytellers, keepers of the old traditions and the ancient wisdom that had guided their people through centuries of hardship. Einar had spent so much energy trying to escape that legacy that he had forgotten to preserve what was worth keeping. The morning air was sharp and clean as they set out on the familiar trail that wound up through the pine forest toward the high meadows. Snow crunched beneath Skadi's hooves, and their breath mingled in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry mountain air. These were the moments when Einar felt most at peace, when the rhythm of the horse's gait and the vast silence of the mountains seemed to wash away the accumulated weight of years and regrets. He had chosen this particular trail because it led to his favorite overlook, a rocky promontory that offered a sweeping view of the fjord and the distant peaks beyond. It was a place where he could sit quietly and think, where the scale of the landscape put his personal troubles into perspective, where he could sometimes hear Astrid's voice in the wind and feel her presence in the warming touch of the sun. But today, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Einar felt a strange restlessness that he couldn't quite name. It was as if the very air around him was charged with possibility, as if something was waiting to be discovered in the familiar landscape he thought he knew so well. Skadi seemed to sense it too, her ears pricked forward with unusual alertness, her steps more eager than they had been in months. The trail wound through a grove of ancient pines, their trunks thick with age and their branches heavy with snow. This was old forest, the kind that had stood here long before the first Vikings had ever set foot on these shores, long before Christianity had come to challenge the old gods, long before the modern world had begun its relentless march toward progress and change. There was something comforting about that continuity, something that made Einar feel connected to all the men who had walked these paths before him, seeking solitude and understanding in the unchanging presence of stone and tree and sky. As they emerged from the forest into a high meadow, Einar noticed something different about the landscape ahead. Where there should have been a familiar slope leading up to his favorite overlook, there was instead a raw scar of exposed rock and displaced earth. A rockslide, probably triggered by the recent heavy snows and the freeze-thaw cycle that came with the changing seasons. Such events were not uncommon in these mountains, but this one was larger than most, and it had dramatically altered the familiar contours of the hillside. Skadi picked her way carefully around the edge of the slide area, her hooves finding purchase on the stable ground while loose stones clicked and rattled down the slope. Einar guided her with gentle pressure from his knees, his attention focused on navigating the treacherous footing. It wasn't until they had safely passed the worst of the debris that he noticed what the rockslide had revealed. There, carved into the living rock of the mountainside, was the dark mouth of a cave. The cave mouth gaped before them like a 19, wound in the mountain's flesh, dark and mysterious against the white snow and grey stone. Einar dismounted slowly, his boots finding uncertain purchase on the loose scree that had been exposed by the rockslide. The opening was perhaps 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, large enough for a man to enter, but small enough that it had been completely hidden until the recent geological upheaval had torn away the rock face that had concealed it. Skadi snorted nervously, her ears flicking back and forth as she caught scents that spoke of deep places and long-buried secrets. Einar approached the cave entrance with the caution of a man who had learned to trust his instincts, one hand resting lightly on the knife at his belt, a tool more than a weapon these days. But old habits died hard. The air that drifted from the cave's mouth was cold and still, carrying with it the mineral scent of stone and something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket, a concession to modern practicality that Astrid had insisted upon for his mountain excursions. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls of natural stone that had been shaped and smoothed by human hands. This was not merely a natural cave, it was a place that had been deliberately modified, expanded, perhaps even sealed. The floor was level and dry, covered with a fine layer of dust that showed no footprints, no signs of recent disturbance. "Stay here, old friend," he murmured to Skadi, who seemed more than happy to remain in the sunlight. "I'll not be long." But even as he spoke the words, Einar knew they were not entirely true. Something about this place called to him with a voice older than memory, deeper than conscious thought. He stepped across the threshold and felt the temperature drop by several degrees, the silence closing around him like a physical presence. The beam of his flashlight revealed walls covered with carved symbols, runes in the old script that his grandfather had taught him to read when he was barely old enough to hold a carving knife. The passage extended perhaps 20 feet into the mountain before opening into a larger chamber. Einar's footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, each sound seeming to multiply and return to him from unexpected directions. The air grew thicker as he moved deeper, heavy with the weight of centuries and the presence of something that waited in the darkness ahead. When he reached the chamber, Einar stopped so suddenly that he nearly dropped his flashlight. The beam trembled in his hand as it revealed what lay before him, and for a moment he questioned his own eyes, his own sanity. There, arranged with ceremonial precision on a raised stone platform in the center of the chamber, was the perfectly preserved body of a Viking warrior. The man lay on his back, with his hands folded across his chest, dressed in the leather and mail of a warrior from centuries past. His weapon, a long sword of obviously fine craftsmanship, rested at his side, and his shield bore the unmistakable design of a raven in flight. But it was the ring on his finger that made Einar's breath catch in his throat, the ring that bore the same family crest that Einar himself wore, the twisted serpent design that had been passed down through generations of Grimson men. With hands that shook despite his efforts to steady them, Einar approached the platform. The warrior's face was gaunt but peaceful, his beard long and grey, his skin preserved by the cold, dry air of the sealed chamber. He had been perhaps 60 years old when he died, a man in the prime of his wisdom, if not his physical strength. Around his neck hung an amulet that Einar recognized from family stories. Thor's hammer, carved from whalebone and inlaid with silver. The walls of the chamber were covered with runic inscriptions, some carved deeply into the stone, others painted in what looked like ochre and charcoal. Einar moved his flashlight slowly across the ancient text, his grandfather's teachings returning to him with surprising clarity. The runes spoke of honor and betrayal, of oaths sworn and broken, of a mission that had ended in failure and shame. But the light was dim, and the script was archaic, and much of the meaning remained tantalizingly beyond his grasp. What he could read made his heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. This was Bjorn Grimson, called Bjorn the Bold, who had lived according to the dates carved into the stone more than 300 years ago. He was Einar's ancestor, a great-great-grandfather whose name had been spoken with reverence around family hearths when Einar was a child. But the stories Einar remembered told of a great hero who had died gloriously in battle, not a man who had died alone in a sealed cave, apparently in shame and disgrace. The runes spoke of a blood oath, a sacred promise that bound not just Bjorn, but all his descendants until it should be fulfilled or the bloodline should end. They spoke of betrayal by trusted allies, of a mission that had been abandoned when courage failed, of a choice between personal honor and family survival that had been decided wrongly. The exact nature of the oath remained unclear, obscured by damaged runes and archaic language, but its weight pressed down on Einar like a physical burden. Near Bjorn's left hand lay an ornate dagger, its blade etched with binding runes that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, even in the weak light of the flashlight. The handle was carved from black wood and inlaid with silver wire that formed patterns too complex for casual examination. This was clearly a ceremonial weapon, one used for the swearing of oaths and the binding of souls to sacred purposes. Blood had stained the blade once, though it had long since dried to a dark residue that flaked away at the lightest touch. Einar found himself drawn to touch the ring on Bjorn's finger, to confirm with his own flesh the reality of what his eyes were telling him. The metal was cold but not brittle, and as his skin made contact with the ancient silver, he felt a shock that seemed to run through his entire body. For just a moment, the chamber seemed to fill with voices speaking in the old tongue, with the sound of wind and waves and the clash of weapons. Then the sensation passed, leaving him gasping and shaken, unsure whether what he had experienced was real or merely the product of an overexcited imagination. The implications of this discovery crashed over him like a cold wave. If the family stories were wrong, if Bjorn had died in shame rather than glory, then everything Einar thought he knew about his heritage was built on a foundation of lies. More troubling still was the suggestion that some ancient obligation remained unfulfilled, that the failures of the past might still have consequences for the living. He spent another hour in the chamber, using his flashlight to examine every detail, to read what runes he could decipher, to understand as much as possible about this ancestor who had died alone with his shame. The air grew colder as the day advanced, and eventually the practical concerns of the living world reasserted themselves. Skadi would be growing restless, and the winter daylight was precious and brief. But as Einar prepared to leave the chamber, he made a decision that would change everything. This discovery was too important, too potentially dangerous, to share casually. The truth about Bjorn's fate, whatever that truth might be, could shatter the carefully constructed peace that Einar had built for himself and his family. Until he understood more about what had happened here, until he could decipher the full meaning of the runic inscriptions, he would keep this secret to himself. He took one last look at his ancestor's peaceful face, noting the resemblance that 3 centuries had not entirely erased. Then he turned and walked back through the passage toward the light and the world of the living, carrying with him the weight of knowledge that would give him no rest until it was fully understood. Outside, Skadi greeted him with obvious relief, nuzzling his shoulder and breathing warm air against his cheek. The familiar comfort of her presence helped to ground him in the present moment. But as he mounted and turned toward home, Einar's mind was already racing with questions that would haunt his dreams and drive him to return to this place again and again until its secrets were finally revealed. The ride home passed in a blur of churning thoughts and half-formed questions. Einar found himself constantly looking back over his shoulder toward the mountainside, where the cave mouth waited in shadow, as if Bjorn himself might emerge from that dark opening to demand answers for 3 centuries of neglect. Skadi sensed her master's distraction and picked her way down the mountain trail with the careful attention of a horse that had learned to compensate for human preoccupation. By the time they reached the farm, the short winter day was already fading into dusk, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of blue and purple. Einar tended to Skadi with automatic efficiency, his hands performing the familiar tasks of unsaddling and grooming, while his mind remained fixed on the chamber deep in the mountain. He fed her extra oats, a guilty offering for his inattention during their ride, and made sure her water trough was free of ice before trudging toward the farmhouse through snow that crunched beneath his boots like broken glass. The house felt smaller when he entered it, as if the discovery in the cave had somehow expanded his awareness beyond the comfortable boundaries of his daily life. The war axe above the fireplace seemed to regard him with new significance. No longer just a relic of his personal past, but a symbol of the warrior tradition that stretched back through generations of Grimson men. Had his father known about Bjorn's shameful end? Had his grandfather, who had taught him to read the old runes, deliberately concealed the truth about their ancestors' failure? Einar built up the fire and settled into his favorite chair with a cup of strong coffee. But sleep proved impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bjorn's face in the flashlight's beam, peaceful in death but somehow accusatory, as if the ancient warrior was asking why his descendant had taken so long to find him. The ring on the dead man's finger had felt warm to the touch, despite 3 centuries in that cold chamber, and Einar found himself unconsciously rubbing his own family ring, feeling the raised serpent design that marked him as a true son of the Grimson line. The next morning brought no relief from his obsession. After the most basic chores were completed, feeding Skadi and the sheep, checking that the water pipes hadn't frozen, Einar found himself in his workshop, pulling down books and papers that he hadn't touched in years. His grandfather's journal, written in a mixture of Norwegian and the old runic script, contained genealogies and family stories that Einar had largely ignored during his years of trying to escape his violent heritage. Now he studied them with desperate intensity, searching for any reference to Bjorn the Bold and the circumstances of his death. The official family history, as recorded in his grandfather's careful handwriting, told the expected story. Bjorn had been a great warrior and leader, respected throughout the northern kingdoms for his courage and wisdom. He had led successful raids against the Danish coast and had been instrumental in defending their homeland against Saxon incursions. His death was recorded simply as falling gloriously in battle against overwhelming odds, with no mention of shame, failure, or unfulfilled oaths. But now that Einar knew what to look for, he began to notice inconsistencies in the family stories. Bjorn's death was never described in the detailed, heroic terms that characterized other family legends. No songs were attributed to him, no specific battles named as his greatest triumphs. It was as if someone had deliberately obscured the truth, creating a sanitized version of history that protected future generations from the knowledge of their ancestors' failure. Einar spread out sheets of paper on his workbench and began making rubbings from memory of the runic inscriptions he had seen in the cave. His grandfather had taught him the old script, but Einar's knowledge was incomplete, rusty from decades of disuse. The runes he could remember seemed to speak of a sacred mission, something involving the protection of holy men, Christian monks, perhaps from the depredations of other Viking raiders. But the exact nature of Bjorn's oath remained tantalizingly unclear. The blood oath dagger haunted his thoughts as well. Such weapons were not used lightly in the old traditions. They bound the swearer not just to a course of action, but to the consequences of failure, and those consequences often extended beyond death to affect the entire bloodline. If Bjorn had sworn such an oath and then broken it, the spiritual pollution of that failure might have been passed down through the generations, affecting every descendant until the debt was paid or the bloodline ended. As the day progressed, Einar found himself increasingly unable to concentrate on anything else. He burned his breakfast while staring out the window toward the mountains. He left tools scattered across his workbench, abandoned half-finished carvings, and neglected to collect the eggs from his small flock of chickens. The normal rhythms of farm life, which had provided structure and meaning for 3 decades, suddenly felt trivial compared to the mystery that waited in the sealed chamber. By afternoon, he had made a decision that he knew was both necessary and dangerous. He would return to the cave with better equipment, proper lighting, writing materials, perhaps even a camera to document what he found. The runic inscriptions needed to be copied accurately if he was ever going to decipher their full meaning, and there might be other artifacts in the chamber that he had missed in his shock at discovering Bjorn's body. Skadi seemed reluctant when he approached her stall with saddle and bridle, as if she too sensed that something had changed in their quiet routine. She submitted to being saddled, but moved with obvious reluctance, her ears back and her steps shorter than usual. Animals were sensitive to spiritual disturbances, Einar knew, and perhaps she could feel the weight of ancestral obligations that now pressed down on her master's shoulders. The second visit to the cave felt different from the first. Where yesterday had brought wonder and shock, today brought a grim sense of purpose that made every shadow seem potentially threatening. Einar had brought a powerful camping lantern, notebooks, pencils, and even a measuring tape, approaching Bjorn's final resting place with the methodical attention of a scholar rather than the emotional reaction of a shocked descendant. The additional light revealed details that had been lost in the weak beam of his flashlight. The chamber was larger than he had first realized, with alcoves carved into the walls that held additional artifacts, pottery, tools, weapons, and what appeared to be scrolls wrapped in oiled leather. The runic inscriptions covered not just the walls, but parts of the ceiling as well, creating a complete narrative that would take days or weeks to fully transcribe and translate. As Einar began the painstaking work of copying the ancient text, he became aware of a growing sense of urgency that had nothing to do with the approaching winter darkness. Something in the runes spoke of time running out, of obligations that became more binding with each passing generation, of consequences that would eventually demand payment regardless of the living family's awareness or preparation. The blood oath that Bjorn had sworn was not simply a historical curiosity, it was a debt that still existed, waiting to be settled by whatever descendant finally possessed the courage and knowledge to complete what their ancestor had failed to finish. Over the following weeks, Einar made daily pilgrimages to the cave. each visit revealing new layers of the mystery that had consumed his thoughts. The winter weather cooperated with his obsession, providing clear, cold days that made the mountain trail passable, even as snow continued to accumulate in the higher elevations. Skadi had grown accustomed to these journeys, though she remained visibly uncomfortable whenever they approached the cave entrance, often refusing to graze nearby and keeping her attention fixed on the dark opening as if expecting something to emerge from its depths. The transcription work progressed slowly but steadily. Einar's rusty knowledge of the runic script improved with practice, and patterns began to emerge from what had initially seemed like random symbols carved into stone. The story they told was far more complex and disturbing than he had first imagined. Bjorn had not simply failed in some generic heroic quest. He had been entrusted with a specific mission that involved protecting a group of Christian monks who were carrying sacred relics from Ireland to Norway, fleeing Viking raiders who sought to destroy both the holy men and their precious cargo. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Bjorn the Bold, descendant of generations of Viking warriors, had sworn a blood oath to protect Christians from his own people. The political and spiritual implications of such a choice would have been staggering in his time, marking him as a traitor to everything his ancestors had fought and died for. Yet the runes made it clear that Bjorn had believed this mission to be of cosmic importance, worth risking not just his own life and honor, but the spiritual welfare of all his descendants. The blood oath dagger became the focus of Einar's most intense study. Each time he examined it, more details became apparent in the lantern's steady light. The binding runes etched into the blade were in an archaic script that predated even the inscriptions on the walls, suggesting that this weapon had been ancient, even in Bjorn's time. The wooden handle was carved from what appeared to be yew, a tree sacred to the old gods and associated with death and transformation. Silver wire formed intricate patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly, creating optical illusions that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. Most disturbing of all was the gradual realization that the dagger had been used for its intended purpose. Dark stains on the blade, which Einar had initially assumed to be rust or mineral deposits, proved to be something else entirely when examined closely. Bjorn had cut himself with this weapon, had sealed his oath with his own blood, according to the most binding traditions of their people. Such oaths were believed to create a spiritual connection that transcended death, linking the swearer's soul to the promised task until it was completed or the bloodline was extinguished. As Einar worked to decipher more of the runic narrative, a clearer picture of Bjorn's final days began to emerge. The Christian monks had been ambushed by raiders led by Bjorn's own brother, Hakon the Ruthless, a man whose name did appear in the family stories as a great warrior who had died young under mysterious circumstances. Faced with the choice between honoring his blood oath to protect the monks and maintaining his loyalty to his family, Bjorn had hesitated at the crucial moment. That hesitation had cost the lives of the holy men and the loss of the sacred relics they carried, leaving Bjorn to face the spiritual consequences of his failure. The final entries in the runic chronicle spoke of Bjorn's voluntary exile to this cave, his decision to seal himself away from the world rather than continue living with the shame of his broken oath. He had died here alone, surrounded by the artifacts of his failure, waiting for a descendant who might possess the courage and wisdom to complete what he had begun. The binding nature of the blood oath meant that his spiritual debt had passed to his children, and their children, and their children's children, accumulating interest like a loan that could never be repaid through normal means. Einar found himself studying his own reflection in the cave's still pools of water, searching for resemblances to the ancient warrior whose failure had apparently shaped the destiny of their entire bloodline. The physical similarities were undeniable. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same broad shoulders that had made the Grimson men formidable fighters for generations. But more, Troubling was the growing recognition of spiritual similarities, the same stubborn pride that had led Bjorn to swear an impossible oath, the same tendency toward isolation when faced with problems that seemed too large for normal solutions. The implications for his own family became more apparent with each visit to the cave. His sons, Magnus and Olaf, were also bound by this ancient obligation, though they remained completely unaware of its existence. Every choice they made, every success or failure in their lives, might be influenced by the spiritual weight of Bjorn's unfulfilled promise. The pattern of troubled relationships that had characterized the Grimson men for generations, the tendency toward violence, the difficulty maintaining close family bonds, the sense of always fighting against some invisible opposition might all be manifestations of this ancestral debt. Einar's health began to suffer from the combination of physical strain and emotional stress. The daily rides to the cave in increasingly harsh weather were taking their toll on both him and Skadi. But he found himself unable to stop returning to that chamber where past and present intersected in ways that defied rational explanation. His appetite diminished, his sleep became fitful and filled with dreams of ancient battles and broken promises, and his hands developed a persistent tremor that made the detailed work of transcribing runes increasingly difficult. The workshop at the farm became a secondary site of obsession, its workbenches covered with runic translations, genealogical charts, and historical research gathered from books borrowed from the nearest library. Einar spread the family's story across multiple surfaces, like a detective trying to solve a crime that had been committed centuries before his birth. The official histories, the family legends, the archaeological evidence, and the runic testimony all had to be reconciled into a coherent narrative that explained not just what had happened to Bjorn, but what it meant for the living members of the Grimson bloodline. As the days shortened and the winter storms grew more frequent, Einar made a discovery that changed everything once again. Hidden behind a loose stone in one of the cave's alcoves, he found a sealed container made of hammered bronze and wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow survived 3 centuries of moisture and decay. Inside, protected from the elements that had claimed so much else, were additional scrolls written in Bjorn's own hand, containing not just the story of his failure, but detailed instructions for how his descendants might finally complete the mission that had cost him everything. The bronze container's contents spread across Einar's kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 3 centuries to be assembled. Bjorn's scrolls, written in a mixture of runic script and early Norwegian, contained not just the story of his failure, but a detailed accounting of what would be required to fulfill the blood oath and free the Grimson bloodline from its spiritual burden. As Einar worked by lamplight to translate the ancient text, the wind howled around the farmhouse with unusual ferocity, as if the very elements were responding to the disturbance of long-buried secrets. The sacred relics that Bjorn had failed to protect were described in meticulous detail. 3 items of immense spiritual significance: a fragment of the true cross brought from Jerusalem by Irish pilgrims, a illuminated manuscript containing lost gospels written by early Christian saints, and a silver chalice that had been blessed by St. Patrick himself before his death. These artifacts had been lost when the monks were murdered, but Bjorn's research suggested they had not been destroyed. Instead, they had been hidden by the surviving monk, a young brother named Kolm, who had escaped the massacre and fled deeper into the Norwegian wilderness. The implication struck Einar like a physical blow. If the relics still existed, if they could be found and properly protected, as Bjorn had originally sworn to do, then the blood oath might finally be fulfilled. But the task would be monumentally difficult, requiring not just physical courage, but spiritual preparation that could take months or years to complete. Bjorn's instructions spoke of purification rituals, of pilgrimages to sacred sites, of sacrifices that went far beyond anything Einar had imagined when he first discovered the cave. As he sat, surrounded by ancient documents and flickering candlelight, Einar became aware that he was no longer alone in the house. The familiar presence of Astrid's memory, which had been a source of comfort for 5 years since her death, now felt more immediate and urgent than ever before. He could almost see her sitting across from him at the kitchen table, her gentle eyes filled with the wisdom and compassion that had guided him through the darkest years of his transformation, from warrior to farmer. "What would you have me do?" he whispered to the empty air, knowing that she would not answer directly, but hoping that some part of her spirit might still be accessible to him in this moment of crisis. "How can I choose between honoring the dead and caring for the living?" The answer came not in words, but in memory. Astrid's voice from years past, speaking about the importance of healing old wounds, of taking responsibility for the actions of previous generations, of being willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good. She had always believed that every person had the power to change the patterns that bound their families, to break cycles of violence and create new legacies based on love rather than fear. But even as Einar felt the pull of his ancestral obligation, practical concerns intruded upon his spiritual wrestling. The bronze container had also contained a letter addressed to him personally, written in Magnus's familiar handwriting and dated just 3 days earlier. His eldest son had apparently tried to call several times without reaching him, had even driven up from Oslo to find the farmhouse empty and no indication of where Einar might have gone. The letter's tone grew increasingly worried as Magnus described attempts to contact his father that had gone unanswered. More troubling still was the letter's final paragraph, which revealed that Olaf was in serious trouble in Bergen. His younger son had apparently become involved with dangerous people, had borrowed money he couldn't repay, and was now facing threats that Magnus feared might escalate to violence. Olaf had refused his brother's offers of help, claiming that his problems were his own responsibility, but Magnus believed that only their father's intervention might convince the younger man to accept assistance before it was too late. The timing felt like cruel irony. Just as Einar had discovered the path to fulfilling his ancestral obligations, his living family faced a crisis that demanded his immediate attention. The pattern was depressingly familiar, the same conflict between duty to the past and responsibility to the present that had destroyed Bjorn 3 centuries earlier. Was this how the Blood Oath worked its vengeance on the Grimson bloodline? By creating impossible choices that guaranteed failure, regardless of which path was chosen. Einar stood at the kitchen window, looking out toward the mountains where Bjorn waited in his stone tomb, then back at the letter that spoke of immediate danger to his youngest son. The wind had died down, leaving the night silent except for the settling sounds of the old house and the distant sound of Skadi moving restlessly in her stall. Even his faithful horse seemed to sense the weight of the decision that pressed down on her master's shoulders. The practical voice in his head, the one that sounded remarkably like Astrid when she had been trying to guide him away from his most destructive impulses, argued for immediate action. Olaf was alive and in danger now, while Bjorn had been dead for centuries and could wait a little longer for his vindication. The blood oath might be spiritually significant, but family obligations to the living took precedence over debts to the dead. But another voice, one that spoke with the authority of generations of Grimson warriors, whispered that this was exactly the kind of thinking that had led to Bjorn's failure in the first place. The blood oath was not simply a historical curiosity. It was a binding spiritual contract that would continue to poison the family bloodline until it was properly fulfilled. Every generation that failed to complete Bjorn's mission would pass an increased burden to their children, and eventually, the accumulated weight of that failure would destroy them all. As the night progressed toward dawn, Einar found himself pacing the farmhouse like a caged animal, moving from room to room without purpose, picking up objects and setting them down again without seeing them. The war axe above the fireplace seemed to watch him with accusatory eyes, asking why he had abandoned the warrior's path if he was not prepared to see it through to its ultimate conclusion. The wedding ring on his finger, Astrid's final gift to him, felt suddenly heavy with the weight of promises that might conflict with ancient obligations. By morning, the decision had crystallized in his mind with the cold clarity of winter air. He would go to Oslo, would help Magnus deal with whatever crisis threatened Olaf, and would fulfill his responsibilities as a father and grandfather. But he would not abandon Bjorn's mission. He would simply delay it until his living family was safe. The blood oath had waited 3 centuries for fulfillment. Surely it could wait a few months longer while he dealt with more immediate concerns. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the practical nor the spiritual voices in his head, but it was the only choice that allowed him to live with himself while moving forward. As he began to pack for the journey to the city, Einar tried to ignore the growing certainty that he was repeating his ancestors' mistake, choosing the easier path over the righteous one, and hoping that good intentions would somehow be enough to avoid the consequences that had destroyed every previous generation. The drive to Oslo in his old pickup truck gave Einar too much time to think, too many hours to second-guess the decision that had seemed so clear in the early morning light. The winter landscape rolled past his windows like scenes from a half-remembered dream: snow-covered forests, frozen lakes, and distant mountains that reminded him constantly of the cave where Bjorn waited in his stone tomb. Every mile that took him farther from the farm felt like a betrayal of his ancestral obligations, yet every mile also brought him closer to a son who might need him more than any ancient warrior ever could. Magnus lived in a modern apartment complex on the outskirts of Oslo, all glass and steel that spoke of success in the contemporary world, but felt alien to a man who had spent most of his life surrounded by wood and stone. Einar sat in the parking lot for several minutes before climbing the stairs to his son's door, using the time to compose himself and push down the guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. Magnus deserved his full attention, not a father distracted by mysteries that had been dead for centuries. His eldest son answered the door on the first knock, as if he had been watching from the window. Magnus was a good-looking man at 45, tall and lean like his father, but with his mother's gentler features and intelligent eyes. He had inherited Astrid's gift for reading people's emotional states, and Einar could see the mixture of relief and concern that crossed his face as he took in his father's appearance. "You look terrible," Magnus said, without preamble, stepping aside to let Einar enter the apartment. "When did you last eat a proper meal or sleep through the night?" The apartment was warm and comfortable, decorated with photographs of Magnus's family and examples of his architectural work. His wife Ingrid was visiting her mother with their 2 children, Magnus explained, which gave father and son the privacy they needed to discuss the crisis that had brought them together. Einar accepted a cup of coffee and settled into an armchair that was probably worth more than most of his farm equipment, but his mind kept drifting to the bronze container hidden in his kitchen and the translations that remained unfinished. "Tell me about Olaf," Einar said, forcing himself to focus on the present crisis rather than the ancestral one that haunted his thoughts. Magnus's expression darkened as he described his younger brother's situation. Olaf had always been the more reckless of the 2 sons, drawn to dangerous pursuits and complicated relationships in a stead way that reminded both Magnus and Einar uncomfortably of the old Viking spirit that ran in their bloodline. His work as a fishing boat captain had brought him into contact with smugglers and other criminal elements operating out of Bergen's harbor, and somewhere along the way he had become involved in activities that went far beyond legitimate fishing. The details were murky. Olaf had been characteristically secretive about the exact nature of his troubles, but Magnus had pieced together enough information to understand that his brother owed substantial amounts of money to people who were not inclined toward patience or mercy. There had been threats, escalating pressure, and indications that Olaf's creditors were prepared to use violence to collect what they were owed. Magnus had offered to help financially, but Olaf's pride had prevented him from accepting assistance, even when the alternative might be serious physical harm. "He won't listen to me," Magnus said, running his hands through hair that was beginning to show grey at the temples. Says he got himself into this mess and he'll get himself out, but I don't think he understands how dangerous these people are. They're not just local criminals, they have connections to international trafficking networks, drug smuggling, things that are completely beyond what Olaf is equipped to handle. As his son spoke, Einar found himself thinking about the patterns that seemed to repeat themselves across generations. Olaf's stubborn refusal to accept help echoed Bjorn's isolation in his final days, and both situations seemed to stem from the same source, a pride that prevented Grimson men from admitting weakness or asking for assistance when they most needed it. Was this another manifestation of the Blood Oath's curse, the way ancient failures shaped the behavior of their descendants, even when they had no conscious knowledge of the spiritual forces that influenced their choices? "What do you want me to do?" Einar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Talk to him," Magnus replied. "He might listen to you in a way he won't listen to me. You understand the kind of pride that's driving him. You've been there yourself. Maybe you can make him see that accepting help isn't the same as admitting defeat." The irony was bitter and unmistakable. Magnus was asking his father to do exactly what Einar himself was struggling with, to set aside destructive pride and accept help when it was offered. But while Einar wrestled with spiritual obligations and ancestral debts, Olaf faced dangers that were immediate and physical. The parallel was uncomfortable but undeniable. They talked for hours, sharing coffee and the kind of conversation that Einar had avoided for too many years. Magnus spoke about his work, his family, his concerns about the direction the world was taking, and his hopes for his children's future. He also talked about missing his mother, about the way Astrid had been the emotional center that held their family together, and about his fear that her death had left them all adrift without the anchor she had provided. She would have known what to do about Olaf, Magnus said as afternoon faded toward evening. She always knew how to reach him when no one else could. Einar nodded, thinking about Astrid's wedding ring that he still wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, but always present against his heart. She had possessed an intuitive wisdom about family relationships that had guided them through crisis after crisis during their marriage. Her absence had left a void that none of them had learned to fill, and perhaps that emptiness was part of what made Olaf so vulnerable to the dangerous choices that had brought him to this crisis. As they prepared for the journey to Bergen the next morning, Einar made a decision that surprised even himself. He told Magnus about finding the cave, about discovering Bjorn's body and the evidence of ancient obligations that might still bind their family. He didn't share all the details. The blood oath and its spiritual implications seemed too complex and potentially disturbing for a son who had built his life on modern rationality. But he spoke about feeling connected to their heritage in ways that demanded attention and respect. Magnus listened with the careful attention he gave to all his father's words, but Einar could see the concern in his eyes. To a successful architect living in contemporary Oslo, his father's sudden interest in ancient family history probably seemed like the beginning of an unhealthy obsession, especially given Einar's obvious physical deterioration and emotional distraction. It was another burden of guilt to add to the growing weight that pressed down on Einar's shoulders, the knowledge that his spiritual crisis was affecting not just his own well-being, but his ability to be present for his family when they needed him most. The journey to Bergen took them along the western coast of Norway, through landscapes that seemed increasingly familiar to Einar, despite the fact that he had rarely traveled this route. The fjords and mountain passes triggered memories that felt older than his own experience, as if he was seeing these places through eyes that had viewed them centuries earlier. Magnus drove while Einar stared out at the grey waters of the North Sea, thinking about Viking longships that had once carried warriors and raiders along these same coastal routes. They found Olaf at a dockside bar that catered to fishermen and merchant sailors, a dimly lit establishment that smelled of salt air, diesel fuel, and decades of spilled beer. Einar's younger son looked older than his 42 years, with premature grey in his beard and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much worry. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing a beer and watching the door with the alertness of a man who expected trouble to walk through it at any moment. The reunion was awkward, filled with the careful conversation of men who loved each other but had forgotten how to show it. Olaf was suspicious of his brother's sudden appearance and clearly uncomfortable with what he saw as interference in his private affairs. But Einar noticed something else in his younger son's manner, a spiritual restlessness that reminded him uncomfortably of his own recent obsession with the cave and its mysteries. "You look like hell," Olaf said to his father, echoing Magnus's earlier assessment. "When did you start losing so much weight?" Before Einar could answer, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of three men who clearly did not belong in a fisherman's bar. They were too well-dressed, too confident, and they moved with the predatory grace of people accustomed to using violence to solve problems. The leader, a thin man with cold eyes and expensive clothes, approached their table with the kind of smile that promised pain. "Olaf Grimsson," the man said in accented English, suggesting Eastern European origins, "you have been avoiding our calls." What followed was a tense negotiation that revealed the true scope of Olaf's troubles. He owed money not just to local criminals, but to an international trafficking network that used fishing boats to smuggle drugs and other contraband through Norwegian waters. Olaf had agreed to allow his boat to be used for one such operation, but the cargo had been intercepted by customs officials, leaving him responsible for a debt that far exceeded his ability to pay. Einar listened to the details with growing horror, not just at the immediate danger his son faced, but at the way the situation seemed to mirror the patterns described in Bjorn's runic chronicles. Once again, a Grimsson man had made a choice that compromised his honor for what seemed like practical necessity, and once again, the consequences threatened to destroy not just the individual, but his entire family. The confrontation ended with threats and a deadline. Olaf had 1 week to produce the money he owed, or the consequences would extend beyond financial penalties to physical retribution. As the criminals left the bar, Einar made a decision that surprised both his sons. Rather than discussing plans to help Olaf escape his predicament, he announced his intention to return immediately to the farm to retrieve something that might help them understand the full scope of the crisis they faced. The drive back to the mountains passed in tense silence, with Magnus clearly frustrated by his father's mysterious behavior and Olaf suspicious of any solution that didn't involve immediate cash or immediate flight. But Einar had recognized something in the lead criminal's accent and manner that connected to information he had discovered in Bjorn's hidden scrolls. The trafficking network that threatened his son might have connections to the same criminal elements that had destroyed the Stord, Christian monks 3 centuries earlier. Back at the farm, Einar led his sons to the cave with a sense of inevitability that felt like destiny finally asserting itself. The winter afternoon was crisp and clear, perfect for the revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about their family history. Skadi greeted them with obvious relief. She had been alone for 3 days and was clearly worried about her master's absence, but she still showed reluctance to approach the cave entrance. The impact on Magnus and Olaf was everything Einar had expected and more. Seeing their ancestors' preserved body in the lantern light, examining the runic inscriptions that told of ancient failures and spiritual obligations, handling artifacts that connected them directly to their heritage, all of it combined to shatter their modern, rational understanding of their place in the world. But it was the hidden chamber that provided the revelation that changed everything. Einar had discovered the secondary passage only the day before leaving for Oslo, following a crude map carved into the stone near Bjorn's feet. The passage led deeper into the mountain, through natural caverns that had been modified and expanded by human hands. The air grew colder as they descended, and strange acoustics made their voices echo in ways that suggested vast spaces hidden in the darkness beyond their lantern light. The lower chamber was larger than the first, with walls covered in Christian symbols alongside the older runic script. But it was what lay at the center of the chamber that stopped all three men in their tracks. There, arranged on a stone altar with ceremonial precision, were the sacred relics that Bjorn had died trying to protect. The fragment of the true cross was mounted in a silver reliquary that gleamed despite centuries in the cave. The illuminated manuscript lay open to a page decorated with intricate Celtic designs and text in Latin that spoke of redemption and sacrifice. The silver chalice sat beside them, its surface covered with engravings that seemed to move in the flickering light, telling stories of saints and miracles that connected the Christian present to the pagan past. "He didn't fail," Einar whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Bjorn didn't fail, he succeeded. The realization hit all three men simultaneously. The runic inscriptions they had read told only part of the story, the part that Bjorn had recorded during his darkest moments of despair. But the evidence before them revealed the truth. He had saved the relics, had protected them from destruction, and had given his life to ensure they would be preserved for future generations. The shame and failure that had haunted the Grimson bloodline for 3 centuries was based on incomplete information, a tragic misunderstanding that had poisoned every subsequent generation. Magnus was the first to understand the broader implications. If Bjorn succeeded, then there was no broken oath, no spiritual debt, no curse on our family. Olaf, despite his practical nature, was staring at the artifacts with something approaching awe. "These things, they're real? They're actually what you say they are?" Einar nodded, but his attention was focused on a new set of runic inscriptions that covered the walls of this lower chamber. These runes told a different story, one of sacrifice and redemption, of a mission completed at great personal cost. Bjorn had not died in shame, he had died in triumph, having chosen to protect sacred objects rather than claim them for his own glory or profit. The blood oath dagger, when examined in this new context, revealed its true purpose. It had not been used to swear an oath of vengeance or conquest, but to seal a promise of protection and service. The blood Bjorn had shed was not a binding to violence, but a consecration to peace, a pledge to use his warrior's strength in defense of the sacred, rather than in the pursuit of personal gain. As the three men stood in the presence of artifacts that bridged the gap between their pagan heritage and Christian present, Einar felt a spiritual transformation that was both sudden and complete. The weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for weeks, the guilt over ancestral failures, the fear of inherited curses simply lifted and disappeared. In its place came a new understanding of what it meant to be a Grimson man, not a destroyer but a protector, not a seeker of personal glory, but a guardian of things that mattered more than individual ambition. The trafficking network that threatened Olaf suddenly seemed like more than just a criminal problem. It was an opportunity to honor Bjorn's true legacy by choosing protection over profit, family over fear, and courage over compromise. The Christian cross felt warm in Einar's weathered hands, its silver surface smooth from centuries of reverent touch. As he held the sacred relic in the caves of the flickering lantern light, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a Grimson. The violent legacy he had spent 30 years trying to escape was not the true inheritance of his bloodline. It was a distortion, a misunderstanding that had poisoned generations of his family because they had never known the complete truth about Bjorn's sacrifice. Magnus approached the illuminated manuscript with the careful reverence of a man who recognized priceless historical artifacts, his architect's eye taking in details that spoke of masterful craftsmanship and incredible age. "These belong in a museum," he said softly. But even as he spoke the words, he seemed to understand that their significance transcended academic or monetary value. These were not merely historical curiosities, they were the focus of a spiritual mission that had shaped their family's destiny for more than 3 centuries. Olaf stood apart from his father and brother, his expression torn between wonder, and skepticism. The fishing captain's practical nature rebelled against accepting supernatural explanations for his current troubles. But he could not deny the physical evidence before his eyes, or the strange sense of rightness that filled him as he stood in this sacred space. "So what does this mean for us now?" he asked. "How does finding these things help with the mess I'm in?" Einar carefully replaced the cross on its altar and turned to face his sons, feeling more certain of his purpose than he had in decades. "It means we understand who we really are," he said. "Not raiders or destroyers, but protectors, not seekers of personal glory, but guardians of things that matter more than our individual comfort or safety." The journey back down the mountain was filled with intense discussion as the three men worked through the implications of their discovery. Magnus, with his systematic mind, focused on practical considerations. The relics needed to be properly preserved, authenticated by experts, and eventually placed where they could be safely displayed and studied. But even he acknowledged that their immediate priority had to be dealing with the criminal threats against Olaf. Olaf himself seemed transformed by the cave experience, though he struggled to articulate exactly how his perspective had changed. The restless energy that had driven him to make dangerous choices seemed channeled now toward a different kind of purpose, one that involved accepting responsibility rather than running from it. "I can't just keep hiding," he said as they reached the farmhouse. "These people, they're not going away, and involving you both just puts more lives at risk." Einar spent that evening in his workshop, surrounded by the translations and research that had consumed him for weeks, but now took on entirely new meaning. The runic inscriptions that had seemed to speak of failure and shame could be read differently when viewed through the lens of Bjorn's ultimate success. What had appeared to be records of defeat were actually chronicles of a spiritual struggle that ended in triumph, though at great personal cost. As he worked, Einar became aware that his physical health, which had deteriorated during his weeks of obsessive research, was beginning to improve. The weight that had pressed down on his shoulders, literally and figuratively, was lifting. His appetite returned, his hands stopped trembling, and for the first time in months he slept deeply and peacefully, untroubled by the nightmares that had haunted his rest. Magnus and Olaf took turns reading from Bjorn's chronicles, helping their father piece together a complete picture of their ancestors' final mission. The story that emerged was one of extraordinary courage and spiritual transformation. Bjorn had begun as a typical Viking warrior, motivated by personal honor and material gain, but his encounter with the Christian monks had opened his eyes to different values. When faced with the choice between easy profit and difficult service, he had chosen service, even knowing that his decision would be misunderstood by his contemporaries and might cost him everything. The monks Bjorn had died protecting were not just random holy men. They were keepers of sacred knowledge, preservers of texts and artifacts that connected the early Christian church to its roots in the ancient world. The relics they carried represented not just monetary value but spiritual continuity, links in a chain of faith that stretched back to Christ himself. By protecting these objects, Bjorn had become part of something larger than his individual life, part of a mission that transcended the boundaries between pagan and Christian, past and present. As dawn approached, the three men found themselves making plans that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Rather than helping Olaf flee his creditors or finding ways to pay his debts, they were preparing to confront the trafficking network directly, using the truth about their family heritage as a source of strength rather than a burden to be escaped. The plan they developed was both simple and audacious. They would return to Bergen together, not as desperate men seeking to negotiate with criminals, but as representatives of something more ancient and powerful than mere money or violence. The relics would remain safely hidden in the cave, their location known only to the three Grimson men, but the knowledge of their existence and significance would become a tool for transformation rather than concealment. Einar felt a particular urgency about saying goodbye to Skadi. sensing that the confrontation ahead would mark a fundamental change in his life, regardless of its outcome. His faithful horse greeted him with her usual gentle affection, but there was something different in her dark eyes, a sense of completion that suggested she, too, understood that their mountain rides together were coming to an end. He spent extra time grooming her silver coat and making sure her feed was supplemented with the sweet oats she preferred, wanting her to know that their partnership had been one of the great treasures of his later years. The farmhouse required preparation as well. Einar packed away his research materials, secured the bronze container with its precious scrolls, and made arrangements for neighbors to care for his livestock if the confrontation in Bergen prevented his immediate return. There was a finality to these preparations that felt appropriate, not because he expected to die, but because he understood that the man who returned from this mission would be fundamentally different from the one who left. Magnus called his wife to explain that he would be delayed returning home, describing the situation in carefully neutral terms that conveyed seriousness without revealing the supernatural elements that would have been difficult for a modern, rational woman to accept. His architectural projects would have to wait while he helped his family deal with what he described simply as a crisis that affects all of us. Olaf proved to be the most practical of the three when it came to understanding their opponents. His months of involvement with the trafficking network had given him insights into how such organizations operated, their strengths and weaknesses, their methods of intimidation and control. They're used to dealing with desperate people, he explained. People who are afraid, who feel isolated, who think they have no choices. They're not prepared for someone who approaches them from a position of spiritual strength. The drive back to Bergen was filled with a sense of anticipation that felt different from the anxiety that had characterized their previous journey. Where before they had been reactive, responding to crises created by others, now they were taking initiative based on their own understanding of what needed to be done. The landscape that had seemed threatening and alien just days earlier now felt familiar and welcoming, as if the land itself approved of their mission. As they entered the outskirts of the coastal city, Einar found himself thinking about Astrid and the conversations they had shared about the nature of courage. She had always maintained that true bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act correctly despite fear, to choose service over self-preservation when the stakes were high enough to matter. "You don't become brave by avoiding difficult choices," she had told him during one of their late-night talks. "You become brave by making the right choice, even when it costs you everything." The trafficking network's representatives had agreed to meet them at the same dockside bar where the previous confrontation had taken place, but Einar sensed that this encounter would follow a very different pattern. They were no longer supplicants seeking mercy or debtors hoping to negotiate more favorable terms. They were Grimson men, heirs to a legacy of protection and service, prepared to honor their ancestors' sacrifice by choosing courage over compromise. As they parked near the harbor and prepared to face whatever waited inside the bar, Einar touched the chain around his neck, where Astrid's wedding ring rested against his heart, drawing strength from her memory and from the knowledge that his choices would honor not just his beloved wife, but generations of ancestors who had faced similar moments of testing. The sacred relics waited safely in their mountain cave, but their spiritual power accompanied the three men as they walked toward the confrontation that would determine whether the Grimson bloodline would continue the pattern of protective service that Bjorn had established with his life. The dockside bar felt different when they entered it together, 3 generations of Grimson men united by purpose rather than divided by misunderstanding. The atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke and the conversations of sailors who had spent too many months at sea. But Einar moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his true strength. Magnus flanked him on the left, his architect's eye taking in potential exits and defensive positions, while Olaf walked on his right, No longer the desperate debtor, but a fishing captain who understood these waters better than any foreign criminal ever could. The trafficking network's representatives were already waiting at the same corner table where they had delivered their ultimatum just days earlier. But this time, the leader, the thin man with cold eyes and expensive clothes, was not alone. Two additional men sat with him, larger and more obviously violent than their predecessor, the kind of muscle that criminal organizations employed when intimidation escalated toward actual force. Their presence sent a clear message about the network's intentions and their assessment of Olaf's likelihood of paying his debts. Einar approached the table without hesitation, his weathered hands relaxed at his sides, carrying his father's shield across his back, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of what the Grimson men had always truly represented. The shield bore the same raven design that had decorated Bjorn's equipment in the cave, but now Einar understood its real meaning, not a bird of war and death, but a messenger between worlds, a guardian of sacred knowledge that transcended the boundaries between life and death, past and present. "Gentlemen," he said in English, his accent thick but his words clear and carefully chosen, "I am Einar Grimson, father of the man you seek to intimidate. I understand you have business to discuss." The leader's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty as he took in this unexpected development. Clearly, he had expected to deal with a desperate debtor and perhaps his equally desperate family members, not with an elderly man who radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from deep spiritual conviction. "Your son owes us money," he said, but his voice lacked the casual menace that had characterized their previous encounter. "My son made a mistake," Einar replied, settling into the chair across from the criminals with the deliberate movements of a man who was exactly where he belonged. "But mistakes can be corrected, and debts can be paid in many different ways. The question is whether you are interested in a solution that benefits everyone, or whether you prefer the kind of violence that ultimately serves no one's interests." Magnus and Olaf took seats on either side of their father, creating a united front that clearly unsettled the trafficking network's representatives. These criminals were accustomed to dealing with isolated individuals who felt they had no choices and no support, not with families who stood together and projected strength rather than fear. "We are not social workers," the leader said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "We are businessmen who expect our investments to be repaid with interest. Your son understood the terms when he accepted our offer. Terms that were based on deception," Olaf interjected, his voice steady despite the danger he faced. "You presented yourselves as legitimate cargo clients, not as smugglers who would put my boat and my crew at risk." The contract was fraudulent from the beginning. One of the larger men started to rise from his chair, clearly intending to use physical intimidation to end the discussion. But Einar's voice stopped him with a single word, spoken in the Old Norse tongue, a command that carried the authority of generations of warriors who had faced far more dangerous opponents than common criminals. The man sat back down, looking confused but somehow compelled to comply with instructions he didn't understand in a language he didn't recognize. "You see," Einar continued, switching back to English, "you are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about who you are dealing with. You assume that because we are Norwegian fishermen, we are simple people who can be easily frightened or controlled. But our family has been protecting these waters for more than 1,000 years, and we understand currents that run deeper than any shipping channel or smuggling route." The leader leaned forward, his cold eyes fixed on Einar's face. "Are you threatening us, old man?" "I am educating you," Einar replied calmly, "about the difference between temporary profit and lasting consequences, about the wisdom of choosing cooperation over conflict when dealing with people who have more resources and deeper connections than you realize." Magnus spoke for the first time, his architect's precision evident in every word. "We have a proposal that could resolve this situation to everyone's benefit. But it requires you to understand that continuing to threaten our family will create problems for your organization that extend far beyond the relatively small amount of money you believe you are owed." The trafficking network's representatives exchanged glances, clearly trying to assess whether they were dealing with empty bluster or a genuine threat to their operations. Their body language suggested growing uncertainty about a situation that had seemed straightforward when they first approached Olaf, but was rapidly becoming more complex than they had anticipated. Einar reached into his coat and withdrew a small object that gleamed in the bar's dim lighting, a piece of silver, bearing ancient markings that seemed to capture and hold the available light in ways that defied normal optical physics. The artifact was one of several small relics that Bjorn had carried with him into the cave, blessed objects that connected their bearer to spiritual authorities that transcended national boundaries or criminal jurisdictions. "This," he said, placing the silver piece on the table where all the criminals could see it, "represents connections that your organization cannot afford to challenge. Walk away from this conflict now, and we will consider the matter closed. Continue to threaten my family, and you will discover that some debts create consequences that extend far beyond anything you are prepared to handle." The silver artifact seemed to pulse with its own inner light as the criminals stared at it, their expressions shifting from confusion to something approaching fear. The leader reached toward the object, then withdrew his hand as if the metal had burned him, though Einar had not moved to prevent the contact. Whatever power the ancient relic carried, it was not something that could be touched casually or handled by those whose intentions were purely destructive. "What is that thing?" one of the larger men asked, his voice carrying an uncertainty that had not been there moments before. "A reminder," Einar replied, carefully returning the artifact to his coat, "of authorities that existed long before your organization was imagined and will continue long after it has been forgotten. My family has been entrusted with certain responsibilities that we take very seriously, and threatening us brings consequences that extend beyond anything your lawyers or enforcers are prepared to handle." The leader attempted to regain control of the situation through aggression, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "We are not impressed by parlor tricks or family folklore. Your son owes us money, and we will collect it one way or another." Magnus leaned forward, his architect's mind having worked through the practical implications of what his father was attempting to accomplish. "You're missing the larger picture," he said calmly. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about whether your organization wants to continue operating in these waters, or whether you prefer to find yourselves dealing with authorities that don't recognize international borders or diplomatic immunity." Olaf spoke next, his knowledge of harbor operations giving weight to his words. "Every port, from Bergen to Stavanger, knows my boat, knows my crew, knows my reputation. You think you can operate here without the cooperation of people like me? You think you can move cargo through waters that we've been fishing for generations without our knowledge and consent?" The 3 generations of Grimson men had created something that none of them could have achieved individually, a presence that combined Einar's spiritual authority, Magnus's strategic thinking, and Olaf's practical knowledge into a force that the criminals found increasingly difficult to dismiss. The silver rings they all wore seemed to catch the bar's dim lighting, creating a visual reminder of their connection to something larger than themselves. "You are making threats you cannot back up," the leader said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "We are offering you information," Einar corrected, "about the nature of the forces you have chosen to challenge and the wisdom of accepting graceful retreat when it is offered. Continue this course, and you will discover that some conflicts create consequences that cannot be resolved through violence or intimidation." As if summoned by Einar's words, new figures began entering the bar, fishermen and dockworkers who recognized Olaf and had heard about the trouble he was facing. They did not approach the table directly, but their presence created a subtle shift in the atmosphere that the criminals could not ignore. What had begun as a private negotiation was becoming a public confrontation, with the community itself choosing sides in a way that isolated the trafficking network's representatives. Magnus noticed the change first. His architect's eye trained to see how spaces and their occupants interacted to create specific effects. "You should also consider," he said quietly, "that continuing to threaten our family in a public place, surrounded by people who have known us for decades, might not be the strategic choice your organization would prefer." The leader looked around the bar, finally registering that the casual conversations at nearby tables had stopped and that multiple pairs of eyes were fixed on their corner with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility. His expensive clothes and foreign accent, which had seemed like advantages in earlier encounters, now marked him as an outsider in a community that protected its own. "This is not over," he said, standing abruptly and gesturing for his companions to follow. "No," Einar agreed, remaining seated with the calm assurance of a man who had achieved exactly what he intended. "But it is transformed. You came here expecting to collect a debt through fear and violence. You are leaving with the understanding that some debts create obligations that extend beyond money, and some families have resources that transcend what can be measured in conventional terms." The three criminals left the bar quickly, their departure watched by dozens of eyes that conveyed a clear message about community solidarity and the consequences of threatening local families. The silence that followed their exit was broken by the gradual resumption of normal conversation, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction that suggested the harbour community approved of what had just transpired. Olaf looked at his father and brother with an expression that combined relief, gratitude, and something approaching awe. "How did you know that would work?" "Because," Einar replied, touching the chain around his neck, where Astrid's ring rested against his heart. "Some kinds of strength cannot be purchased or intimidated. They can only be inherited, developed through service, and shared among people who understand that true power comes from protecting what matters rather than destroying what stands in your way." The three rings they wore, grandfather, father, son, caught the light one final time as they stood to leave, creating a visual symbol of the continuity that connected them to Bjorn's sacrifice and to all the generations that would follow. The trafficking network's threat had been neutralized, not through violence, but through the demonstration of a different kind of authority, one that drew its power from spiritual conviction rather than material force. Spring came early to the Norwegian mountains that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that extended far beyond the melting snow and emerging wildflowers. Einar stood at his kitchen window, watching the morning sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose, but his perspective on the familiar landscape had been fundamentally transformed by the events of the winter past. The war axe still hung above his fireplace, but it no longer seemed like a relic of shame. It was simply one tool among many that had served its purpose in its time and could now rest in honored retirement. The bronze container that had once held Bjorn's hidden scrolls now contained a different kind of treasure, the beginning of a new family chronicle that Einar had started writing in the weeks following their return from Bergen. The true story of Bjorn's mission, the location and significance of the sacred relics, and the spiritual transformation of 3 generations of Grimson men, filled page after page in his careful handwriting, creating a record that would ensure future generations understood their real heritage. Skadi had passed peacefully in her sleep just 2 weeks after their confrontation with the trafficking network, as if she had been waiting to see her master safely through his spiritual crisis before allowing herself to rest. Einar had buried her in the meadow where they had taken so many rides together, marking her grave with a stone carved with runic symbols that celebrated faithful companionship and the bonds that transcend the boundaries between species. Her death had brought sadness, but not the crushing grief he might have expected. Instead, there was gratitude for the years they had shared and recognition that some partnerships are completed rather than simply ended. Magnus visited the farm more frequently now, often bringing his wife Ingrid and their 2 children for weekend stays that filled the old house with the kind of life it had been designed to hold. The children, 8-year-old Eric and 6-year-old Astrid, named for their grandmother, explored the mountains with the fearless enthusiasm of youth, while their parents worked alongside Einar to preserve and document the family's newly understood history. Magnus had taken responsibility for photographing and cataloguing the relics in the cave, creating a permanent record that would allow scholars to study them without disturbing their resting place. Olaf's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of the 3 men, the restless energy that had driven him toward dangerous choices was now channeled into legitimate enterprises that honored his family's maritime heritage. He had started a business guiding historical tours along the Norwegian coast, sharing stories of Viking exploration and Christian conversion that drew from his newfound understanding of the complex spiritual currents that had shaped their ancestors. His boat, no longer tainted by association with criminal elements, carried tourists and scholars who were eager to understand the real history of these waters. The family's relationship with the sacred relics had evolved into something both protective and practical. The artifacts remained safely hidden in their mountain cave, but knowledge of their existence had been shared with selected scholars and religious authorities who could appreciate their significance without threatening their security. Einar had been approached by representatives of the Vatican, the Irish National Museum, and several universities, all seeking access to objects that bridged crucial gaps in their understanding of early Christian history in Northern Europe. Rather than simply granting or denying these requests, Einar had negotiated a series of agreements that allowed scholarly access while maintaining Grimson family control over the relic's ultimate disposition. The cave had been discreetly reinforced and equipped with environmental controls that would preserve the artifacts for future generations, while carefully managed visits provided researchers with the opportunity to study materials they could never have hoped to examine otherwise. The spiritual dimensions of their guardianship had proven equally important. Einar found himself in correspondence with monks, priests, and spiritual advisors who understood the sacred nature of the family's responsibility and offered guidance on maintaining the proper reverence for objects that connected the living world to its deepest sources of meaning. The blood oath that had once seemed like a curse was now recognized as a calling, a spiritual vocation that gave purpose and direction to lives that might otherwise have been adrift in the modern world's spiritual emptiness. As summer approached its peak, Einar made a decision that felt both inevitable and surprising. He would write to his grandsons, Eric and young Astrid, creating letters that they could read when they came of age to understand their family's true legacy. But unlike previous generations, these children would not be burdened with shame or confusion about their heritage. They would inherit a story of protection and service, of ancestors who had chosen sacrifice over profit and spiritual wealth over material gain. The letters would tell them about Bjorn the Bold, who had died not in failure but in triumph, having protected sacred objects that connected all people to something larger than their individual lives. They would learn about their grandfather's journey from warrior to farmer to guardian, and about the way spiritual transformation could happen even in the twilight years of a man's life. Most importantly, they would understand that being a Grimson meant being part of an ancient tradition of protection and service that would continue as long as the family bloodline endured. On a clear morning in late June, exactly 6 months after his first discovery of the cave, Einar made one final pilgrimage to the chamber where Bjorn rested in peace. The sacred relics gleamed in the improved lighting that Magnus had installed, their presence creating an atmosphere of reverence that seemed to extend far beyond the stone walls that contained them. Einar knelt before his ancestor's tomb and spoke words of gratitude in the Old Norse tongue, thanking Bjorn for his sacrifice and promising that his true legacy would be preserved and honored by all who came after. As he prepared to leave the cave for what he somehow knew would be the last time, Einar felt the presence of all his ancestors, not just Bjorn, but generations of Grimson men and women who had faced their own moments of testing and had chosen honor over ease, service over selfishness. Their strength would live on, through Magnus and Olaf, through little Eric and young Astrid, through children yet unborn who would inherit not a curse, but a calling to protect what was sacred in a world that too often forgot the difference between price and value. The mountain trail back to the farm had never seemed shorter or more welcoming, and Einar walked it with the steady pace of a man who had finally found his way home.